The clock on the mantel struck the midnight hour, each chime resonating like a funeral knell through the suffocating silence of the Duke's inner sanctum. The only light in the room came from a dying fire and a single candelabra on the mahogany desk, casting long, predatory shadows that danced across Derek Norton's uncompromising features. He didn't look up as Nora Stark entered, though the soft rustle of her gray silk gown was the only sound in the cavernous room. She stood before him, a figure of quiet, desperate elegance, her emerald eyes reflecting the flickering flames as she stared at the heavy vellum documents laid out between them. Derek's fingers, steady and cold as the iron he forged in his mills, slid a fountain pen across the leather surface. He finally lifted his gaze, his eyes devoid of the warmth one might expect for a bride-to-be. Instead, they held the clinical detachment of a merchant finalizing an acquisition. The air between them was thick with the scent of old parchment and the bitter frost of his indifference. He didn't offer her a seat, nor did he offer a hand. He merely watched her, measuring her worth by the strength of her lineage and the perceived resilience of her frame. "Before you put ink to paper, Lady Nora, let us ensure there are no romantic delusions clouding this arrangement," he stated, his voice a low, rhythmic grate that felt like flint striking steel. Nora's breath hitched, but she did not look away. She knew the stakes. She knew the ruin her family faced if she walked out of this room without his name. Derek leaned forward into the light, his jaw set in a grim, unyielding line. "I am restoring a legacy that my predecessors saw fit to dismantle. This union is a pillar of that restoration, nothing more. I require your presence at my table, your poise at my side, and your womb to carry the Norton name." He paused. The silence stretched until it felt as though it might snap. "I do not require your heart, Nora. In fact, I would prefer you kept it well guarded. Love is a friction this machine cannot afford, and I have no intention of providing a home for your sentiments." Nora felt the words settle over her like a shroud, cold and final. She looked at the man who would be her husband, seeing the handsome, marble-carved face of a stranger who viewed her as a strategic fortification. She reached for the pen, her fingers trembling only slightly as they brushed against his. For a fleeting second, the heat of his skin sent a jolt of electricity through her, a spark of life in the frozen room. But he withdrew his hand instantly, as if her touch were a breach of contract. With a neat, controlled script, Nora signed her name, tethering her soul to his iron-bound world. She had accepted the terms of her beautiful prison. As Derek gathered the papers, filing her away into a drawer along with his other debts and deeds, Nora realized she had just become the most expensive piece of property in Nortonville. She walked out of the study as she had come, silent and invisible, leaving behind the girl who dreamed of love and carrying out the Duchess who was now merely a means to an end. The heavy iron gates of Nortonville clicked shut behind Nora, a sound that resonated like the locking of a cell. As she stepped into the foyer of Norton Manor, the sheer scale of stone and shadow seemed designed to diminish anything living. Derek stood at the top of the grand staircase, a silhouette of sharp angles and cold authority. He offered no greeting, only a curt nod to the housekeeper to show the new Duchess to her rooms. Nora, clutching the skirts of her signature gray silk, felt the chill of the house seep through her slippers, but she did not let her shoulders sag. If this was to be her prison, she would at least make it a home. In the weeks that followed, Nora became a quiet revolutionary. She moved through the drafty corridors with a soft, persistent energy that Derek found increasingly disruptive to his solitude. It started with the light. He returned from the ironworks one evening to find the oppressive gloom of the dining hall pierced by the warm amber glow of beeswax candles and the strategically placed lamps Nora had unearthed from the attic.
The harsh, clinical glare he preferred had been replaced by a gold that softened the jagged edges of the family portraits. He sat in silence, his fork poised, watching the way the light played across Nora's throat as she ate. It was a variable he hadn't accounted for, a visual warmth that made his chest feel strangely tight. Then came the life. Derek's study overlooked a courtyard that had been nothing but gray slate and dead ivy for a decade. One morning, the rhythmic scratching of his pen was interrupted by a flash of color below. Nora was there, kneeling in the dirt, her gray sleeves pushed up to reveal pale, slender forearms. She was planting winter aconite and snowdrops, her hands moving with a tenderness he found baffling. He stood deep in the shadows of his window, hidden by the heavy velvet curtains, and watched her. He told himself he was merely monitoring her property, ensuring she didn't damage the stonework, but he stayed long after his tea had gone cold. He was transfixed by the way she tilted her head back to catch the rare winter sun, a small secret smile touching her lips. This burgeoning interest unsettled him. According to his iron code, Nora was a functional necessity, a vessel for the Norton future. Yet he found himself lingering in the hallways, hoping to catch the faint scent of lavender that now followed in her wake. He began to notice the small things, the way she rearranged the heavy books in the library to be more accessible, the way she spoke to the servants with a kindness that made them stand a little straighter. Derek remained a ghost in his own home, observing him from doorways and darkened corners. He was a man of coal and iron, unyielding and fixed, yet he felt himself being pulled towards her light like a moth to a flame he was forbidden to touch. He wanted to reach out, to ask her why she bothered with flowers in a house of stone, but the words died in his throat. To speak would be to acknowledge her as a person, and Derek Norton was not yet brave enough to admit that his gray duchess was slowly turning his world into something other than shades of ash.
The dining room of Norton Manor was a cavern of obsidian shadows and silver plate, where the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like the steady fall of a guillotine. At one end of the long mahogany expanse sat Derek, his spine a rigid line against the velvet upholstery. At the other sat Nora, a fragile specter in her signature gray silk, her presence so quiet it seemed to barely displace the air. This was their ritual, a symphony of clinking crystal and the soft scrape of knives, conducted in a silence so thick it felt physical. Derek kept his focus on the evening's correspondence, a stack of letters regarding the ironworks expansion. To look at her was to invite the friction he so despised, the distracting pulse of curiosity that had been nagging at him since she arrived. Yet, despite his resolve, his gaze drifted. He noticed the way the candlelight caught the sharp protrusion of her collarbones, more pronounced now than they had been a month ago. Her plate, a masterpiece of roasted pheasant and glazed root vegetables, remained largely untouched. She moved the food around with a listless precision, as if performing a chore she lacked the strength to finish. Her complexion, usually the color of fine cream, had taken on the translucent quality of skimmed milk. In the hollows beneath her emerald eyes, faint violet shadows had begun to bloom. Derek felt a momentary stir of something, a phantom of concern, that he quickly smothered with logic. She was a city girl, he told himself. The isolation of the moors, the transition from a struggling household to the mistress of a dukedom, and the sheer weight of the Norton diamonds were enough to tire any woman. It was the burden of status, he reasoned. She was merely adjusting to the gravity of her new life. "You are not eating, Nora," he remarked, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. Nora started, her fork clattering softly against the porcelain. She didn't look up, but he saw the visible effort she took to steady her breathing.
I am merely not very hungry tonight, Your Grace. The sea air is heavier here than in the south. The Norton line requires a mother of constitution, he replied, his tone sliding back into the clinical detachment of his iron code. See that you do not make a habit of fasting. It would be an inefficient start to your duties. Nora's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass, but she did not drink. Of course, she whispered. He returned to his ledgers, satisfied with his pragmatic assessment. He convinced himself that her frailty was a temporary inconvenience, a minor glitch in the machinery of their arrangement. He ignored the way her hand trembled as she reached for a piece of bread, and he certainly ignored the hollow, haunting look in her eyes as she stared at the dark window. He was a man of iron, and iron did not concern itself with the fading light of a candle. He had secured his duchess. The rest was simply a matter of time and endurance. He did not see the desperate way she swallowed back a wave of nausea, her face turning a shade of ashen gray that matched the very dress she wore. The winter thaw had begun to turn the earth into a heavy weeping mud, but the air remained sharp enough to crystallize the breath. Nora sought refuge in the walled garden, the only corner of Nortonville where the Duke's industrial shadow felt thin. It was there, amidst the skeletons of the hydrangeas she had painstakingly pruned, that the truth finally settled within her. The dizzying spells and the persistent hollow ache in her stomach had coalesced into an undeniable reality. She was carrying the Norton heir. A month ago she might have wept with relief. Now she felt only a chilling dread. She touched her abdomen through the thick wool of her cloak, her fingers trembling. This was the miracle she had prayed for, the bridge she hoped would finally connect her to the man she was learning to love in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. With a heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she hurried back toward the manor, her feet skimming the stone paths. She would tell him now. Perhaps this news would be the key to the iron door of his heart. She reached the study without pause, pushing open the heavy oak doors with a burst of desperate courage. "Derek, The words died in her throat. The room was a whirlwind of violent paper and suppressed rage. Derek stood over his desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the mahogany edge, his face a mask of such terrifying coldness that Nora instinctively recoiled. A stack of legal documents lay scattered on the floor, the ink smeared like fresh bruises. "The bastards!" Derek hissed, his voice a low, predatory growl that didn't even acknowledge her presence. "My cousin's lawyers are challenging the entailment again. They claim my father's secondary debts nullify the direct line. They're circling like vultures, waiting for me to fail." He finally looked at her, but his emerald eyes didn't see a wife. They saw a failing fortification. Nora took a small step forward, her hand still resting on her stomach. "Derek, I have something to tell you, something that changes." "It had better be that you are finally showing signs of a legacy," he snapped, cutting her off with a sharp, dismissive gesture. He paced the length of the room, his boots striking the floor with the finality of a hammer. "I don't need sentiment right now, Nora. I need a weapon. I need an heir to shove in their faces to silence these claims once and for all. If you are pregnant, it's not a blessing, it's a tactical necessity. It's the only trophy that will keep this estate from being torn apart." The joy Nora had been nurturing withered instantly, turned to ash by the heat of his cold ambition. She realized then that to Derek, the life growing inside her wasn't a child to be held, or a miracle of their union. It was a piece on a chessboard, a legal shield, a trophy to be brandished against his enemies. "Is that all it is to you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rattling the window panes. Derek stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression unyielding. "In this world, Nora, results are the only things that matter. Are you pregnant or not?" Nora looked at the man she had hoped to reach, seeing only the iron walls of the Duke of Nortonville. She felt the secret turn cold in her veins. "No," she lied, her voice as flat and lifeless as the winter garden. She turned and walked out, leaving him to his ledgers and his fury, knowing that she wasn't carrying a miracle, she was carrying a secret she would have to protect from the very man who had demanded it. The lie could only hold for so long. By the time the midwinter frost had hardened into iron-slick ice, Nora's condition became a truth that her signature gray silk could no longer conceal. Derek had discovered the reality not through a tender confession, but through a medical report from the estate physician. The explosion of rage she had expected never came. Instead, it was replaced by a terrifying, silent efficiency. Derek summoned the entire household staff to the great hall. He stood on the dais, the light from the chandeliers glinting off his sharp cheekbones, looking more like a monarch addressing subjects than a man sharing joyous news. Nora stood a step behind him, her hands clasped tightly over her stomach, feeling the weight of 100 expectant eyes. "As of this morning," Derek began, his voice projecting with the practiced clarity of a boardroom executive, "the physician has confirmed the viability of the Norton heir. From this moment, the Duchess's schedule is to be cleared of all non-essential duties. Her diet, her rest, and her movements are to be monitored with the utmost scrutiny. We have a legacy to secure, and I expect every member of this staff to treat her safety as the estate's primary objective." There was no cheer, only a formal, rhythmic nodding of heads. It wasn't an announcement of a new life, it was the unveiling of a high-stakes project. Once the staff was dismissed, Derek turned to Nora. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of aristocratic duty. From his pocket, he drew a small velvet-lined box. Inside lay the Norton emerald, a necklace of profound weight and history that had seemed to pulse with a cold green light. The stones were ancient, surrounded by diamonds that looked like shards of frozen tears. "My mother wore this when she carried me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, businesslike murmur. "It is a symbol of the station you now occupy. It is yours to wear until the succession is finalized." He stepped behind her to fasten the clasp. Nora felt the biting chill of the gold against her skin, the heavy stones pulling at her neck like a tether. As he finished, she closed her eyes, leaning back almost imperceptibly, craving the touch of his hand on her shoulder or the warmth of his breath against her ear. Derek stepped back immediately. He looked at her neck, then her stomach, and finally her eyes. For a heartbeat, Nora thought she saw a flicker of something, a shadow of the man who had watched her plant flowers
in the rain. But the iron shutters of his mind snapped shut. He didn't lean in. There was no brush of lips against her forehead, no whispered thank you, no shared smile of wonder. "The jeweler will arrive tomorrow to ensure the fit is perfect," he stated, already turning back toward his study. "Do not overexert yourself, Nora. You are carrying everything I have worked for." As his footsteps receded into the cavernous silence of the manor, Nora looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The emerald sparkled with a cruel, expensive light. She realized then that when she was poor, she had lived on hope. Now, draped in the riches of a duke, she was starving in a house full of food. She was a treasure chest he had locked away in a vault, and for the first time she understood that the most crowded room in the world could be the loneliest place on earth if the one person you loved saw you only as a gold standard insurance policy. The library of Norton Manor was a sanctuary of dust and silence, where the scent of aged parchment mingled with the lingering cold of the stone walls. Nora had taken to spending her afternoons here, seeking solace among the thousands of volumes that didn't demand she be a duchess or a vessel. She was reaching for a heavy, leather-bound tome on botany, the high shelf requiring a stretch that made her vision swim, when the world tilted. The floor beneath her feet seemed to turn to water. The shadows of the tall oak shelves stretched and warped into a dizzying kaleidoscope of dark wood and gold leaf. A cold sweat broke across her brow, and the strength vanished from her knees as the heavy book slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the carpet with a dull thud. She didn't hit the ground. Strong, firm hands clamped around her waist, catching her before she could crumple. Derek had been standing in the shadows of the alcove, watching her with that same unsettling, silent intensity he had honed over the months. He pulled her flush against his chest, his arms winding around her with a frantic strength that betrayed his calm facade. "Nora!" His voice, usually a sharp instrument of command, cracked with a raw, jagged edge of panic. For a long moment, the iron code vanished. Nora leaned into him, her head falling back against his shoulder, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Derek did not pull away. Instead, he buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of lavender and the heat of her skin. His pulse was a frantic hammer against her spine. In that suspended second, he wasn't a duke protecting an investment. He was a man terrified by the fragility of the woman in his arms. His hand moved from her waist to her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin with a tenderness so profound it felt like a confession. The spark was instantaneous, a surge of terrifying, visceral connection that made Derek's breath hitch. It was more than duty, it was a hunger, a recognition of a soul he had spent months trying to ignore. He felt the soft swell of her stomach pressed against him, and for the first time it didn't feel like a legal shield. It felt like theirs. Then the terror set in. The realization of his own vulnerability struck him like a physical blow. To feel this for her was to give her power, the power to destroy the fortress he had built to survive. If he loved her, he could be hurt. If he loved her, the estate wasn't the only thing at risk. Derek stiffened, his body turning back into the unyielding iron Nora knew so well. He abruptly let go of her, stepping back so quickly he nearly tripped over the fallen book. His face masked itself in a familiar, icy distance. "You must be more careful, Nora," he said, his voice regaining its flinty, clinical edge. The physician warned against overexertion. "You are pale, Nora. Go to your room and remain there until dinner." He didn't offer his hand to help her steady herself. He didn't ask if she was all right. He stood with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, as if physically holding himself together. Nora looked at him, the emerald green of her eyes shimmering with the tears she refused to shed. She had felt the spark, too, the momentary heat of a man who cared, but as he turned his back on her to return to the shadows, she realized that the Duke was more afraid of his own heart than he was of any debt or rival. He was a man who would rather be a king in a frozen wasteland than a husband in a warm home. The Peaton Ball was a sea of shimmering silks and blinding chandeliers, a gilded cage designed to showcase the power of the Norton name. Derek had spared no expense, dressing Nora in a gown of silver tissue that seemed to turn her into a statue of living moonlight. Around her neck, the Norton emeralds felt like a yoke of ice pulling at her throat as she navigated the crowded ballroom. To the Tan, she was the picture of a triumphant duchess, the successful acquisition that would secure the Norton line. But beneath the corset and the jewels, Nora was crumbling. A sharp, stabbing pain, a secret complication she had hidden even from the estate physician, radiated through her lower back, making every step a feat of agonizing endurance.
She felt a warmth that shouldn't be there, a terrifying dampness against her inner thigh that made her breath catch in a rhythmic, shallow panic. She reached for a glass of water from a passing tray, but her fingers refused to close. The crystal shattered on the marble floor, a sharp, sudden crack that silenced the nearby guests. "Nora?" Derek's voice reached her from a distance, no longer clipped and businesslike, but edged with a sudden sharp confusion. She tried to turn toward him, to tell him that the trophy was breaking, but her legs had turned to ash. The vibrant colors of the ballroom began to bleed into a singular, suffocating black. The emeralds at her throat felt as heavy as lead weights, dragging her down. The last thing she felt was the rush of cold air as she fell, and the distant, muffled sound of her own name being shouted in a voice that finally sounded like a man who had everything to lose. Then the world went black, leaving the Duke of Nortonville standing amidst the ruins of his perfect evening, staring at the unconscious woman who had finally succeeded in doing the one thing he feared most. Making him feel.
The crash of the water glass was a gunshot in the stifling silence of the ballroom. Derek turned, his mind already formulating a polite excuse for his wife's perceived clumsiness, but the words died as he saw Nora. She didn't just fall, she vanished from the line of sight, her silver tissue gown billowing like a dying star as she collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving marble. For a heartbeat, the Duke of Nortonville remained frozen, the iron code clashing violently against a sudden, paralyzing terror. He saw the guests recoil, heard the sharp, rhythmic intake of breath from the countesses, and caught the first venomous whispers of scandal that would surely follow this public display. In any other moment, the threat of social ruin would have been his primary concern, but as he looked at Nora, so pale she seemed carved from the very floor she lay upon, the estate, the debts, and the Norton legacy simply ceased to exist. He moved before he could think. He shoved past a marquise and a row of gasping debutantes, his polished boots skidding on the broken glass. He didn't care about the optics. He didn't care that he was ruining his reputation by kneeling in the dirt and debris of a public floor. He gathered Nora into his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder with a terrifying weightlessness. The Norton emeralds, the trophy he had draped around her neck, felt like a mockery now, cold, hard stones that couldn't bring the warmth back to her skin. "Nora?" he whispered, his hand trembling as he cupped her face. Her skin was clammy, and a thin line of blood tracked from where she had bitten her lip to stay upright. The whispers of the ton grew louder, a buzzing hive of judgment. "The Duchess! Is it the child? How scandalous! The Duke looks absolutely unhinged." Derek snapped. He looked up, his emerald eyes burning with a localized fury that silenced the nearest circle of onlookers. He didn't see peers or rivals. He saw obstacles between him and the only thing that mattered. The vessel was gone. In its place was Nora, the woman who planted snowdrops in the rain, the woman who smelled of lavender and quiet courage. "A doctor!" he roared, the sound tearing from his throat with a raw, jagged edge. It wasn't the voice of a duke. It was the cry of a man watching his world burn. "Someone find a physician! Damn you all to hell!" His voice broke on the final word, a high, desperate splintering of his iron facade. He tucked her head under his chin, shielding her from the prying eyes of the crowd, and began to carry her toward the exit. He didn't wait for help. He didn't look back at the ruin of his gala. As he sprinted toward the doors, the heavy weight of Nora in his arms felt like the only anchor he had left in a universe that had suddenly, violently turned to ash. He was no longer a duke securing an heir. He was a man begging the heavens for one more minute with the woman he had been too proud to love until she was almost gone. The carriage ride back to Norton Manor was a blur of frantic hoofbeats and the rhythmic, terrifying sound of Nora's shallow breathing.
Derek didn't place her on the seat. He held her against his chest, his cloak wrapped around her silver gown, as if he could physically shield her from the encroaching darkness. By the time they reached the estate, the manor was no longer a monument to his pride. It was a sterile, echoing tomb waiting for a verdict. Inside the Duchess's chambers, the air was thick with the smell of medicinal herbs and the metallic tang of blood. The estate physician moved with a grim, hurried efficiency, his brow furrowed as he worked to stem the secret complication that had finally claimed Nora's strength. Derek was banished to the corner of the room, but he refused to leave. He stood in the shadows, his hands clenched so tightly they bled, watching the rise and fall of Nora's chest. Every ragged breath she took felt like a reprieve. Every pause felt like the end of the world. Hours bled into the deepest part of the night. The physician finally stepped back, his face drawn. "The bleeding has slowed, Your Grace, but she is exhausted. The fever is rising. We are in God's hands now, both for the Duchess and the child." Derek didn't hear the word child. He only saw Nora. As the servants and the doctor retreated to the outer rooms, Derek collapsed into the chair beside her bed. The air was dim, lit only by a dying fire that cast long, flickering shadows across the walls. He reached out, his large, trembling hand covering Nora's small, pale one. Her skin was burning, yet she looked as fragile as a winter leaf. "Nora," he whispered, his voice a jagged ruin. "Nora, please." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the side of the mattress. The iron code wasn't just broken, it was pulverized. He thought of the months he had spent treating her as a ghost, the coldness with which he had demanded a legacy, and the cruelty of the emeralds he had hung around her neck like a price tag. "I don't care," he choked out, the tears finally breaking past his defenses. "I don't care about the Norton name. I don't care about the estate, or the cousin, or the damn heir. Let it all burn. Let the name die with me." He squeezed her hand, desperate for even a flicker of a response. "Just stay. I don't want an heir, Nora. I want you. I want the woman who plants flowers in the rain. I want to tell you that the light in this house didn't come from the candles. It came from you. Please, don't leave me in the dark again." For the first time in his life, the Duke of Nortonville prayed, not for power, not for prestige, but for the survival of the woman he had been too cowardly to love until she was almost gone. He sat there in the silence of his soul, stripped of his title and his pride, a man holding on to a single hand as if it were the only thing keeping him from drifting into the abyss. He promised her everything, his heart, his life, his very breath, if only she would open her emerald eyes and see him one more time. The dawn that broke over Nortonville was not the usual industrial gray, but a pale, soft brold that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the Duchess's chambers. The frantic energy of the night had settled into a profound, exhausted stillness. In a cradle near the hearth, a small bundle, wrapped in fine lawn cotton, stirred, a tiny, healthy cry announcing the arrival of the new Norton heir. But for the first time in his life, Derek Nortonville did not look at the legacy. He remained on his knees by the Nora bedside, his head resting on her hand. When her fingers finally twitched, a weak but intentional movement, Derek's heart didn't just beat, it shattered and rebuilt itself in a single second. Nora's emerald eyes fluttered open, glassy with the remnants of fever, but clear enough to find him. "Derek?" she whispered, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. He let out a jagged, broken sob, pressing her knuckles against his lips. I'm here, Nora. Don't move. Please, just stay." "The baby," she breathed, her gaze drifting toward the cradle. "He is well. He is strong," Derek said, and for once the words held no clinical satisfaction, only a distant relief.
He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, his tears dampening her pillow. I told you last night, and I will say it every day until my last breath. I do not care about the heir. I don't care about the name. If I had lost you to secure this line, I would have spent the rest of my life in a hell of my own making. Nora's breath hitched, a small sob of her own escaping. You wanted a contract. I was a fool, he choked out, the words raw and bleeding with honesty. I thought iron and coal and ledgers were what made a man. I thought staying closed was the only way to stay safe. But I was the one who was truly lost. I was wandering in the dark of my own pride, dying of thirst in a house I called a palace. You were the only thing that was real. You brought the light. You planted the flowers, and you waited for a man who didn't deserve a second of your time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Norton emeralds, the heavy stones catching the morning light. He didn't put them back on her neck. Instead, he set them on the bedside table, as if they were nothing more than common pebbles. I don't want a duchess, he whispered, his voice thick with a love he no longer feared. I want my wife. I want Nora. I love you, not because of what you can give the estate, but because you are the only soul who ever truly saw me. Nora reached up, her hand trembling as she brushed a tear from his cheek. For the first time, Derek didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, finally surrendering his iron code for the warmth of her heart. In the quiet of the morning, the Duke of Nortonville finally realized that while he had built an empire of stone, it was the woman in the gray dress who had given him a world worth living in. Thank you so much for journeying through this emotional story with us today. Your presence means the world to our channel, and we truly appreciate every moment you spend with these characters. If Derek and Nora's journey from a cold contract,
If a story of a winter-blossomed heart to a breathtaking love moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who believes in second chances. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Was it Nora's quiet strength in the garden, or the Duke's heart finally breaking at the ballroom gala? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter of romance and scandal. Your incredible support is the heartbeat of this channel. It motivates us to keep searching for the most moving, emotional, and deeply romantic stories to bring to life just for you. Thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, may you find a love that thaws even the coldest of hearts.